I've spent years as a trail ranger in the Pacific Northwest, and over time I've grown accustomed to isolation and the quiet, sometimes unnerving, whispers of the wilderness. I was stationed in a remote area, reasonable for patrolling trails, monitoring forest conditions, and ensuring that the wildlands remained well maintained. My living quarters were a modest cabin built on old stilts, far removed from any town or paved road. There was not much to it, just the raw elements of the forest surrounding me. The cabin featured a 10-foot balcony that jutted out from its base, accessible only by a sheer drop without any stairs or ladder. It was a constant reminder of the ruggedness and isolation of this place. Local lore was part of a landscape, practically melted into it. I would hear whispers from fellow rangers and hikers about elusive creatures roaming these woods, tales of Bigfoot sightings that most dismissed as myth. Yet on those quiet, long nights, when the silence felt almost too complete, those stories began to seem more plausible. One chilly evening after a long day of trail maintenance and routine checks, I decided to see if I could catch any sign of the unknown. I prepared a small offering, a few pieces of dried fruit, a slice of bread, and some jerky. With a mix of skepticism and a touch of curiosity, I set the bowl right on the edge of the balcony, right where the dark expanse of the forest began. My plan was simple. If anything was out there, it would be drawn to the food, and I might catch a glimpse of it, whether that be the normal wildlife or a 9-foot Sasquatch. I settled onto my cot near the window, the only vantage point to observe the night. Outside, the starry sky was barely visible through the dense canopy of trees, and an eerie silence blanketed the area. I tried to focus on the quiet, but my mind kept drifting back to the legends I'd heard. I thought of the stories of all the shadowy figures and mysterious movements deep in the forest, and I couldn't shake the thought that I was throwing myself into one of those tales. It was sometime after midnight that a sharp rustling woke me up. I crept to the window carefully and looked into the dark. The bowl I had set out was empty, just as I expected. But in the silence, I heard some sort of sound that made my skin crawl. Something that was close by. As my eyes finally adjusted to the night, I saw a glimpse of movement in my peripheral. I snapped my head in its direction, and I swear I saw 4 fingers let go of the balcony edge, as if something had been clinging there and had just released its grip. While it may have been brief and uncertain, that single chilling moment left a mark on me. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop wondering what I saw. I began to question the boundaries of myth and reality, realizing that in the deep silence of the forest, legends can manifest in the most unexpected of ways. Even now, as I continue my duties patrolling these woods and trails, I remain ever watchful. Maybe the forest isn't so silent after all. Its whispers stick with you, whispers of mysteries that can't be solved and refuse to fade. I have a friend who works as a trail ranger, basically a kind of ranger who won't get you in trouble. One night, he was out on the trail with another ranger, removing illegally placed wildlife cameras and knocking down hunting stands, feeders, and blinds. The other ranger wasn't feeling well, so he decided to head back, saying it was a 1-hour ATV ride. My friend finished up the last job when he suddenly heard voices in the distance, even though he was far off the beaten path. He called out, but there was no reply. As dusk fell, he started to head back and soon discovered that his ATV wouldn't start. It turned out the battery had been disconnected. After reconnecting it, he managed to start the ATV again, but it barely moved. Less than half a mile later, the vehicle died completely. He radioed for help, saying that someone needed to come pick him up. They promised to send someone, but it would take about an hour. When he asked if the other ranger had returned, they replied that he hadn't. After the call, he settled down and built a small fire to keep warm. But before long, he heard voices again. This time the voices were arguing. One sounded angry, the other scared. In the darkness, he called out to see if anyone needed help, but the voices never answered. His guess was that they were less than 1,000 feet away. He radioed once more. They said they were having trouble finding his trail and hadn't even left yet. Hoping to get a better idea of his location, he asked them to contact the other ranger who had the map on his iPad. They replied that he still wasn't back. After about 3 minutes or so, the arguing began again. Frustrated and curious, my friend decided to walk toward the voices, hoping these might be two hunters who could help him, and maybe even have a map. But as he got closer, the voices seemed to fade. After about 20 more minutes, he gave up and walked back. Soon after, he received a radio call saying the other ranger had been found. He appeared to have thrown up and passed out, and he was being taken to the hospital. However, the ranger had marked all the locations of the stands, so they had a rough idea of where my friend was. Then his radio went dead. Not long after, the voices returned. Bored and somewhat anxious, my friend listened as the argument continued. Snatches of words like, "Well, it wasn't yours to take," "I don't care," and "You knew better," floated in the air. It sounded like two hunters arguing over a kill. Suddenly, one of them shouted something unintelligible. Then there was silence, and then a gunshot. He quickly doused his fire and hid. For the next half hour, all he could hear was his own breathing, until he spotted ATV lights approaching. He reported everything to the person coming to pick him up, and they radioed back that a search team had looked for him for 3 hours without success. They returned the next day with police and dogs. It wasn't until about an hour later that a shallow grave was found, but inside was a skeleton of someone who had clearly been shot in the head, a man who had already been dead for years. In the end, my friend was left wondering, did the argument end with a gunshot last night, with both hunters just heading home mad but unharmed? Or had he unwittingly overheard the echo of a murder that happened years ago? I've been a ranger with the USFS for almost 15 years, but this event happened early in my career, about 3 years after I joined. We had been getting calls about a lone wolf with a collar hanging around campsites. It was strange because wolves aren't known to be in that area, but after a while you learn that anything is possible. Thankfully, none of the calls mentioned any violent behavior. I left the station around noon to check out the spots where the animal had been seen. I spent about 3 hours wandering the area with no new calls coming in. When I finally took a break for some water and a snack, I was about to head out again when I noticed something about 20 feet away, trotting near a tree line. It looked friendly and had a collar, so I whistled and over it came. Getting a closer look, I realized it wasn't a wolf at all. It was a huge, dark dog with a body structure that didn't quite match that of a wolf, though from a distance it could be confusing. I radioed in to report that I had the dog with me, but as soon as I said I'd bring it in, the dog suddenly took off, almost like it was playing a game to see how far I could chase it. Typical dog behavior, I thought. I gave chase for at least 5 minutes as we ran steadily through the forest. please don't be like me and go running through the woods. I guess unless you know that area like the back of your hand. Finally, the dog slowed down near a rock bed and creek area and began pacing around a spot. I didn't see anything unusual at first, until I noticed that the overgrowth had almost completely hidden what looked like bones. I radioed in immediately, and the other team was sent over to recover the remains. When I went back to retrieve the dog, it was already gone. But honestly, it wasn't a priority at that point. The dog had been friendly, and I figured we'd see it again and catch up with it later. The bones were later identified as those of a teenage male who had died from a self-inflicted wound to the head. He had been reported missing in the area long before I even became a ranger, and there had been very little hope of ever finding him. I eventually spoke with his mom on the phone. She called to thank me personally. She asked how I had found her son, and I then mentioned the black dog. I suddenly thought I'd said something wrong because there was a long pause on her end. After I shared a couple more details about the dog, she quietly explained that her son, who had always struggled with making connections, had sunk into a deep depression after the death of his best friend, the very dog that led me to him. I spent the rest of the day stunned, still in disbelief about everything that happened. It then struck me that we probably wouldn't see that dog again. I don't know what you believe in. There are just some things that don't make sense, no matter how many times you might try to rationalize them in your head. And honestly, in some cases, I don't think they need to.